The rope felt coarse against his weathered palms, each fiber a reminder of the countless cattle he'd lassoed, the horses he'd broken, the life he'd built and watched crumble to dust. Jackson Hartwell stood beneath the ancient oak that had marked the boundary of his ranch for 23 years, its gnarled branches reaching toward a sky that seemed indifferent to his suffering. The same tree where he'd carved his initials with Mary's on their wedding day, where they'd planned to build a swing for the children they'd never had. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind carried the scent of rain across the Montana plains, stirring the tall grass that now grew wild where his cattle once grazed. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, forming the noose with the same precision he'd once used to repair fence lines and mend harnesses. Every knot told a story of competence, of a man who'd made his living with his hands, who'd understood the language of livestock and land better than he'd ever understood people. Jackson's blue eyes, faded now like denim left too long in the sun, surveyed the empty pastures that stretched toward the distant mountains. The Broken Arrow Ranch had been his grandfather's dream, passed down through 3 generations of Hartwells who'd believed that hard work and determination could overcome any hardship. His grandfather had survived the Great Depression. His father had weathered droughts and market crashes. But Jackson had failed them all. The bank notice crumpled in his shirt pocket, felt heavier than lead. Foreclosure. The word tasted bitter as medicine, final as winter. 3 months behind on payments, with no cattle left to sell, no crops to harvest, no hope of recovery. The lawyers had used gentle words: restructuring, refinancing, debt consolidation, but their meaning was clear as mountain air. The Broken Arrow was finished. His boots scuffed against the hard-packed earth as he positioned himself beneath the rope. These same boots had walked him through his first cattle drive at 16, had carried him to the altar when he married Mary, had paced the hospital corridors during her final weeks. Now they would carry him to his last decision. The silence pressed against his eardrums like water. No lowing of cattle, no neighing of horses, no cheerful whistle of ranch hands starting their morning chores. Even the birds seemed to have abandoned this place, sensing the death that hung over it like morning fog. Jackson had always prided himself on being self-sufficient, on solving his own problems without asking for help. But some problems, he'd learned, couldn't be solved with determination alone. Mary's face flickered in his memory, not as she'd looked at the end, pale and thin from the cancer that had eaten away at her like rust on iron, but as she'd been in the beginning, laughing as she tried to mount her first horse, her auburn hair catching the sunlight, dancing in the barn during their wedding reception while his cousin Pete played fiddle and the whole community celebrated their union, singing softly while she tended her vegetable garden, believing with absolute certainty that their life together would be filled with children's laughter and golden anniversaries. The medical bills had started small, manageable. A few doctor visits, some tests, nothing they couldn't handle. But cancer was like a prairie fire. Once it took hold, it consumed everything in its path. Specialist appointments in Denver, experimental treatments in Chicago, desperate trips to clinics that promised miracle cures for the right price. Jackson had mortgaged the ranch, sold the prize breeding stock, liquidated his father's collection of vintage farming equipment. He'd have sold his soul if he'd thought it would buy Mary. Another year, but death was the one creditor who always collected in full. The rope swayed gently in the breeze, its shadow dancing across the ground like a pendulum marking time. Jackson thought about the letter he'd left on the kitchen table, weighted down with his father's pocket watch. He'd tried to explain his decision, to make whoever found him understand that this wasn't about cowardice or selfishness. This was about numbers that didn't add up, about a future that held nothing but shame and failure. He'd written about the ranch's history, about his grandfather's dreams and his father's sacrifices. He'd apologized to Mary's sister in Oregon. to his cousin Pete in Texas, to the few friends who'd tried to help when help was still possible. He'd signed over what little remained to the bank, hoping it might cover some small portion of what he owed. The metal buckle of his belt clinked softly as he adjusted the rope around his neck. Strange how such a simple sound could seem so loud in the absolute quiet of his ruined land. He'd always imagined his final moments would be different, maybe peaceful, surrounded by family, with words of wisdom to pass along to children and grandchildren who would carry on the Hartwell name. Instead, he stood alone beneath an indifferent sky, preparing to end a bloodline that had survived everything the frontier could throw at it. His fingers trembled slightly as he tightened the noose. Not from fear, exactly, but from the finality of it. Once he stepped off the crate he'd positioned beneath his feet, there would be no changing his mind, no last-minute salvation, no miraculous reversal of fortune. The Broken Arrow Ranch would become just another abandoned property, its buildings slowly surrendering to wind and weather until nothing remained but foundation stones and the memories of those who'd known it in its prime. Jackson closed his eyes and thought about the morning routine he'd followed for more than 2 decades. Rising before dawn to check on the animals, watching the sun paint the mountains pink and gold, feeling the satisfaction of honest work well done. He thought about the sound of Mary's coffee percolating on the stove, the way she'd hum old songs while she cooked breakfast, the comfortable silence they'd shared over morning newspapers and ranch plans. All of it was gone now, as surely as if it had never existed. He thought about the town of Cedar Falls, 15 miles down the valley road, where people had stopped meeting his eyes at the general store, where conversations died when he walked into Murphy's Tavern, where children pointed and whispered about the man who'd lost everything, who'd failed where generations of his family had succeeded. The shame burned worse than the grief, ate at his insides like acid. The crate beneath his feet felt solid, real, the last reliable thing in a world that had proved itself fundamentally untrustworthy. Jackson had always believed that good intentions and hard work guaranteed success, that a man who treated others fairly and honored his commitments would be rewarded with prosperity and respect. But life, he'd discovered, made no such promises. His hand moved to the small photograph in his shirt pocket, worn soft from handling. Mary on their honeymoon in Yellowstone, laughing at something he'd said, her eyes bright with love and possibility. He'd carried it every day since her funeral, a talisman against the emptiness that had grown inside him like a tumor. Now it felt like a weight, a reminder of everything he'd lost and could never recover. The wind picked up, setting the rope to turning slowly, and Jackson opened his eyes to take one last look at his inheritance. The main house still stood sturdy and proud, though the porch sagged where a support beam had rotted through. The barn's red paint had faded to rust brown, but its bones remained strong. The corrals and fencing showed signs of neglect, but a determined man with enough money could restore them to their former glory. Someone else would do that restoration. Someone with deeper pockets and better luck. Someone who'd never known the particular agony of watching everything you'd built slip away one piece at a time, powerless to stop the slow hemorrhaging of hope and pride and purpose. Jackson's breath came shallow now, his heart beating fast despite his resolve. This was natural, he told himself. The body's instinct for survival fighting against the mind's decision for release. Animals felt the same panic when they sensed predators nearby. The overwhelming urge to flee, to fight, to do anything except surrender. But Jackson had been fighting for 3 years now, ever since Mary's diagnosis. He was tired of fighting. Rope felt rough against his skin, familiar and foreign at the same time. How many ropes had he handled in his lifetime? Thousands, probably. Lariat ropes for working cattle, lead ropes for training horses, climbing ropes for rescuing animals. From canyon ledges. Rope had been one of his most essential tools, as important as his knife or his rifle. Now it would serve its final purpose. He thought about his father's voice, steady and patient as he taught a 10-year-old boy the proper way to tie a Honda knot. "Son, a rope's only as good as the man who uses it. Treat it with respect, and it'll never let you down." Walter Hartwell had been a man of few words but deep convictions, who'd believed that skill and character were the only real wealth a person could accumulate. What would his father think of this final use of rope? Would he understand that sometimes a man reached the end of his resources, the end of his options, the end of his strength? Or would he see only failure, only weakness, only the shameful surrender of everything the Hartwell name had stood for? The crate creaked beneath Jackson's weight as he shifted slightly, and for a moment he considered climbing down. Walking back to the house, making another pot of coffee, and sitting at the kitchen table to think through alternatives he'd already considered 100 times. But thinking wouldn't change the numbers, wouldn't resurrect the cattle or restore Mary's health or convince the bank to grant extensions that made no economic sense. Some problems had no solutions. The distant mountains stood silent and eternal, witnesses to his private catastrophe. They'd watched his grandfather break the first furrows in virgin soil, had seen his father build the ranch into something worth passing down. Now they would watch the last Hartwell give up the fight, would see the end of a story that had begun with such promise and hope. Jackson's hand tightened on the rope one final time, feeling its weight, its texture, its terrible potential. In a few moments, it would all be over. The debt, the shame, the crushing loneliness that had followed him like a shadow since Mary's death. The Broken Arrow Ranch would become someone else's problem, someone else's opportunity. He'd been standing there for nearly an hour, he realized, letting his mind wander through memories and regrets. The sun had climbed higher, burning off the morning mist and revealing the full scope of his abandoned domain. Empty fields stretched toward the horizon, broken only by the skeletal remains of fence posts and the rutted tracks where cattle trucks had once carried his livelihood to market. This was the moment. No more hesitation, no more delay. Jackson Hartwell took a deep breath of Montana air, closed his eyes, and prepared to step into whatever came after the last breath. The absolute silence of his final moment was broken by something impossible. Sound of children's voices, carried on the wind like an auditory mirage. Jackson's eyes snapped open, his body freezing in place. The voices came again, closer now, high and thin and unmistakably real. Multiple voices, chattering and calling to each other with the particular urgency that belonged only to the young. He turned his head slowly, hardly daring to breathe, and saw them emerging from the tall grass near the old stock pond. 9 children, ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 14, ragged and dirt-streaked and moving with the cautious determination of wild animals approaching a water source. They hadn't seen him yet, hidden as he was behind the massive trunk of the oak tree. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jackson's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. Children, here, now on his abandoned ranch, 15 miles from the nearest town, appearing like apparitions from the morning mist. His hand moved instinctively to loosen the rope around his neck, his entire body trembling with shock and confusion. Where had they come from? What were they doing here? And why, in the name of all that was holy, had they appeared at this precise moment, when he'd finally found the courage to end his suffering? The oldest child, a girl with tangled brown hair and a dress that had seen better seasons, raised her hand to shade her eyes and scanned the ranch buildings. The younger ones clustered around her like chicks around a hen, their faces gaunt but alert. They moved with the wariness of creatures who'd learned that survival depended on constant vigilance. Jackson remained motionless, his heart hammering against his ribs. The rope still hung around his neck, a reminder of how close he'd come to stepping into oblivion. But something had changed in that moment of recognition, some fundamental shift in the weight of the world that pressed down on his shoulders. 9 children, alone, on his land dot, and suddenly, Jackson Hartwell's last day on Earth had become something else entirely. Jackson's fingers fumbled with the rope around his neck, his movements clumsy and urgent as he worked to free himself. The hemp fibers seemed to tighten with his panic, each second stretching like hours while the children's voices grew clearer. He could make out individual words now, fragments of conversation that spoke of hunger, exhaustion, and desperate hope. "Maybe there's a well," one of them said, a boy's voice cracking with thirst. "Look at those buildings," came another, younger and filled with wonder. "Someone might live here." Jackson finally loosened the noose enough to slip it over his head, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The rope fell to the ground with a soft thud, coiling like a sleeping snake at the base of the oak tree. He pressed his back against the rough bark, his mind racing to understand what was happening. The children had reached the old stock pond now, kneeling at its muddy edge to cup water in their hands. Even from this distance, Jackson could see their desperation, the way they drank deeply despite the pond's questionable clarity, the careful way the older ones helped the younger. Their clothes hung in tatters, sun-bleached and stained with travel. Dirt streaked their faces and hands, but beneath the grime, he could see the sharp angles of hunger. The girl who seemed to be their leader stood guard while the others drank, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. She couldn't have been more than 14, but responsibility had aged her beyond her years. Her brown hair had been roughly cut, probably with a knife, and her dress showed evidence of countless repairs. She moved with the fluid awareness of someone who'd learned that danger could come from any direction. "Don't drink too fast, Tommy," she warned a red-haired boy who looked about 8. "You'll get sick again." Tommy nodded obediently, though Jackson could see the effort it took him to slow down. The child's ribs showed clearly through his torn shirt, and his legs trembled with fatigue. How long had they been walking? How far had they come? A smaller girl, perhaps 6 years old, began to cry softly. "I'm still hungry, Lily." The older girl, Lily, knelt beside her, gathering the child into her arms with practiced tenderness. "I know, Sarah, we'll find something soon. Remember what we talked about? We have to be brave." Jackson felt something twist in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced since Mary's death. These weren't ordinary children on some kind of adventure or game. These were survivors, refugees from some disaster he couldn't begin to imagine. The way they moved, the way they talked, the careful rationing of even contaminated water, everything spoke of prolonged hardship. He counted them carefully, 9 total, ranging from the tiny girl called Sarah up to Lily, and what appeared to be a boy of similar age with dark hair and watchful eyes. They clustered together instinctively, never letting anyone wander too far from the group. Jackson recognized the behavior from his cattle, the way young animals stayed close to the herd. When predators might be near, the dark-haired boy raised his head suddenly, nostrils flaring like he'd caught a scent. "Someone's been here recently," he said, his voice low and cautious. "Smell that?" Jackson caught his breath. The boy was right. The lingering odor of his morning coffee still hung in the air, along with the scent of the bacon he'd cooked and barely touched. Evidence of human habitation that these street-smart children had learned to detect. "Marcus is right," Lily said, rising slowly. "Stay together, everyone. If someone's here, they might help us, or—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Jackson understood. These children had learned that adults could be either salvation or threat, with no reliable way to predict which. The youngest boy, who couldn't have been more than 7, tugged at Lily's sleeve. "What if they don't want us here? What if they make us leave?" "Then we leave," Lily replied simply. "But we don't know until we ask." Jackson watched them gather themselves, the older children helping the younger ones to their feet. They moved as a unit, clearly following protocols they'd developed through bitter experience. No one complained about their obvious exhaustion. No one questioned Lily's authority. They simply fell into formation and began walking toward the ranch buildings. His throat felt dry as dust. In a few minutes, they would discover him hiding behind the oak tree like a coward. They would see the rope, understand what they had interrupted. What would he tell them? How could he explain that their arrival had saved him from himself? More urgently, what would he do with them? 9 hungry children on a ranch that barely had enough food for one man, on land that would belong to the bank. Within weeks, he had no legal right to offer them shelter, no resources to provide the care they desperately needed. His practical mind immediately began calculating the cost of feeding 9 growing children, the complications of housing them, the questions that would arise when people in town discovered their presence. But another part of his mind, a part that had been dormant since Mary's death, stirred with something he hadn't felt in months: purpose. These children needed help, and despite his financial ruin, despite his complete failure as a rancher and husband, he still had hands that could work and a roof that could shelter. The group approached the main house cautiously, Lily in the lead with Marcus close beside her. The younger children hung back slightly, ready to run if necessary. Jackson could see them taking in details: the sagging porch, the peeling paint, the general air of abandonment that had settled over his property. But he could also see hope in their faces, the desperate wish that this place might offer what they needed. Lily knocked on the front door, her knuckles barely making a sound against the weathered wood. She waited, then knocked again, harder this time. When no answer came, she tried the handle. The door was unlocked. Jackson rarely bothered with locks anymore, and it swung open with a prolonged creak. "Hello," Lily called into the empty house. "Is anyone here? We're not here to steal anything. We just need help." The honesty in her voice hit Jackson like a physical blow. These children had been abandoned, lost, probably abused, yet they still approached strangers with courtesy and respect. They still believed in the possibility of kindness from adults who had every reason to turn them away. He heard them moving through his house, their footsteps careful and respectful. Through the windows, he caught glimpses of them exploring Marcus, checking the kitchen for food, Lily examining the furniture for signs of recent habitation, the younger children clustering together in the living room like they were afraid to touch anything. "Look," he heard Tommy whisper excitedly. "There's still food in the icebox." "Don't touch it," Lily said sharply. "It's not ours." Jackson closed his eyes, remembering the meager contents of his kitchen. Some eggs, a few strips of bacon, half a loaf of bread going stale. Hardly enough for one man, certainly not enough for 9 hungry children. But it was something, and the restraint these children showed in the face of desperate hunger spoke volumes about the kind of people they were. Sound of Sarah beginning to cry again drifted through the open windows. "I want Mama," she sobbed. "I want to go home." "I know, sweetheart," Lily murmured. "I know, but remember what happened. Remember why we had to leave? We can't go back there." Jackson's mind is filled with dark possibilities. What kind of situation? Forced children to flee their homes with nothing but the clothes on their backs? What had they seen? What had they endured that made living rough in the wilderness preferable to staying where they belonged? Marcus's voice carried clearly from the kitchen. "Whoever lives here hasn't been gone long. The coffee's still warm. Maybe they're just out working somewhere." "We should wait," Lily decided. "If they come back and we're gone, they'll never know we needed help. If they come back and we're here—" She paused, and Jackson could almost see her weighing options with the premature wisdom of someone who'd been forced to make life or death decisions. "At least we can ask." The waiting began. Jackson remained behind the oak tree, paralyzed by indecision and shame. These children had made the brave choice to stay and face an unknown adult who might help or harm them. Meanwhile, he cowered in hiding, unable to face 9 hungry children when he couldn't even feed himself. Through the windows, he watched them settle into his living room with the patience of people accustomed to uncertainty. Lily had found his old quilt, the one Mary had sewn during their first winter together, and spread it on the floor so the younger children could rest. They huddled together for warmth and comfort, their voices dropping to whispers so they wouldn't disturb the home's absent owner. "Tell us about the farm again," Sarah asked, her small voice heavy with exhaustion. "What farm?" Marcus replied, though. Jackson could hear the gentle indulgence in his tone. This was obviously a familiar ritual. "The one where we're going to live," Sarah explained with the absolute certainty of childhood. "With the animals and the garden and the big kitchen where Lily makes pancakes every morning." Lily's voice was soft when she answered. "It's a beautiful place, Sarah. Rolling green hills as far as you can see, with a red barn and white fence posts. There are chickens that lay eggs every day, a cow that gives fresh milk, and a vegetable garden where we can grow everything we need." "And horses?" Tommy asked eagerly. "2 horses," Marcus added, picking up the story. "A big one for working and a gentle one for riding. And there's a swimming hole where the creek bends, perfect for hot summer days." Jackson realized he was listening to a shared fantasy, a communal dream that helped these children endure whatever harsh reality they were fleeing. The farm they described sounded remarkably like the Broken Arrow Ranch had been in its prime, the vision he and Mary had worked so hard to create. "Will we have our own rooms?" asked a quiet boy Jackson hadn't heard speak before. "Everyone gets their own space," Lily promised. "But we'll still stay together. We're family now, remember? We take care of each other." Family. The word hung in the air like a benediction. These children, thrown together by circumstance and tragedy, had created something Jackson had lost when Mary died. They had found belonging in each other, strength in their shared vulnerability. A movement in the kitchen caught his attention. The smallest boy Jackson thought he might be the one called. Tommy had gotten up and was staring longingly at the eggs in the icebox. His small hand reached out, then pulled back. Reached out again, then clenched into a fist at his side. Internal struggle was painful to witness. The child was clearly starving, standing inches from food that could ease his suffering, but he didn't take it. His moral training held even in the face of desperate hunger. Jackson felt his chest tighten with emotion. He thought he'd forgotten how to feel. That was the moment he knew he couldn't stay hidden any longer. Whatever these children's story was, whatever had brought them to his doorstep at the exact moment, he'd planned to end his life. They deserved better than a broken-down rancher who'd given up hope. But they also deserved honesty, and Jackson Hartwell had never been a coward. Even when courage seemed pointless, he pushed himself away from the oak tree, his legs unsteady beneath him. The rope lay where he'd dropped it, a reminder of how close he'd come to missing this moment entirely. He left it there and began walking toward the house, each step feeling like a choice between his planned ending and an uncertain future. The children sensed his approach. Before they saw him, their voices stopped abruptly, and he caught glimpses of movement as they arranged themselves defensively. When he reached the front porch, they were waiting for him, 9 pairs of eyes watching through the open doorway with mixtures of hope and fear. Lily stepped forward, positioning herself between the adults and the younger children. Her chin was raised, her shoulders squared, but Jackson could see the tremor in her hands. "Mister," she said, her voice clear despite her obvious terror, "we're sorry for going into your house without permission. We won't take anything. We just we need help." Jackson stood on his own front porch, looking at 9 abandoned children who had somehow appeared at the exact moment he'd needed them most, and tried to find words that wouldn't sound like the ravings of a man who'd lost everything. "What kind of help?" he finally managed, his voice rusty from disuse. The simple question seemed to unlock something in Lily. Her careful composure cracked slightly, and for a moment she looked like what she was, a 14-year-old girl carrying impossible burdens. "Food," she whispered. "A safe place to sleep. Just for a few days, until we can figure out where to go next." "We're not troublemakers, mister. We work hard. We can earn our keep." Jackson looked at their faces, 9 children who'd lost everything, but still believed that kindness might exist in the world. Children who'd interrupted his final surrender to hope and literally saved his life without knowing it. "My name's Jackson," he said slowly. "Jackson Hartwell. And I think we need to talk." The silence stretched between them like a chasm that neither side knew how to cross. Jackson stood in his own doorway, feeling like a stranger, studying 9 faces that ranged from desperate hope to barely concealed terror. Lily maintained her protective stance, but he could see the exhaustion weighing on her shoulders, the way her small frame trembled with the effort of standing strong for the others. "You all look like you could use some breakfast," Jackson finally sighed, stepping aside to gesture them fully into his house. "Why don't you come in proper, and we'll see what we can rustle up." The invitation seemed to release a collective breath from the group. The younger children looked to Lily for permission, and when she gave a small nod, they filed past Jackson with the careful politeness of people who understood that hospitality could be withdrawn as quickly as it was offered. Tommy was the last to enter, his red hair catching the morning light streaming through the windows. As he passed Jackson, he looked up with eyes that seemed far too old for his 8-year-old face. "Thank you, mister," he said quietly. "We haven't eaten much lately." Jackson's throat tightened. "Well, that's about to change." Inside, the children arranged themselves in his living room with the same careful spacing they'd maintained outside, close enough for comfort, spread out enough to run if necessary. Jackson noticed how they automatically positioned themselves so that no one had their back to a door or window. These weren't ordinary children. They were survivors who'd learned to think tactically. "Sarah needs to use the bathroom," announced a girl who looked about 10, with blonde hair braided into pigtails that had seen better days, but she's scared to ask. Sarah, the smallest of the group, pressed closer to Lily's side and nodded shyly. Jackson pointed down the hallway. "Second door on the right. There's soap and towels in there if you want to wash up." As Sarah scurried away, Jackson caught sight of himself in the hallway mirror. His reflection shocked him, hollow-eyed, unshaven, wearing the same clothes he'd put on to die in. He looked like exactly what he was, a man who'd given up on living. No wonder these children seemed nervous around him. "I'll get some food started," he said, heading toward the kitchen. "You all just make yourselves comfortable." Comfortable. What a ridiculous word to use with 9 homeless children in a house that would soon belong to the bank. But Jackson pushed those thoughts aside and focused on immediate needs. Food first. Everything else could wait. His kitchen supplies were meager, but he made them stretch. 6 eggs scrambled with milk to make them fluffier. The last of his bacon, fried crisp and broken into pieces to distribute evenly. 2 pieces of bread are torn into chunks and toasted in the bacon grease. Coffee for himself and milk for the children, though he only had enough milk for the younger ones. As he cooked, he could hear the children talking in hushed voices. They were discussing him, he realized, trying to figure out what kind of man he was and whether they could trust him. Marcus seemed to be the designated skeptic, his questions sharp and practical. "Why would he help us?" the boy asked. "What's he want in return?" "Maybe he's just kind," Tommy suggested hopefully. "Adults aren't just kind," Marcus replied with bitter certainty. "They always want something." Jackson paused in his stirring, struck by the cynicism in such a young voice. What had these children experienced to make them so wary of adult motives? The question sent a chill down his spine as he considered the possibilities. Lily's voice carried clearly from the living room. "We'll stay alert. If he tries anything wrong, we run. But for now, we need food and rest. We can't keep going much longer on empty stomachs." When breakfast was ready, Jackson called them to his small dining table. They approached cautiously, eyes wide at the sight of hot food. He'd set out his mismatched plates and the few clean forks he could find, arranging everything as normally as possible, despite the surreal circumstances. "Grace," Lily announced, and the children immediately bowed their heads. Jackson, caught off guard, quickly followed suit. "Thank you for this food," Lily said simply. "Thank you for bringing us to safety. Help us to be worthy of the kindness we've received." The prayer was brief but heartfelt, and Jackson found himself moved by its sincerity. When they raised their heads, he gestured toward the food. "Dig in." Watching them eat was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. They consumed every bite with the desperate efficiency of the truly hungry, but their table manners remained impeccable. Someone had taught these children proper behavior, and they clung to those lessons even in extremity. "This is really good." "Mr. Jackson," said the blonde girl. He thought her name might be Emma. "Better than anything we've had in weeks." "It's just eggs and bacon," Jackson replied, embarrassed by the praise for such simple fare. "It's the first hot meal we've had since." Tommy started, then stopped, glancing nervously at Lily. "Since we left home," Lily finished firmly, giving Tommy a warning look that clearly meant some topics were off limits. Jackson didn't push. Whatever had driven these children from their homes was obviously traumatic, and he had no right to pry. But his curiosity was intense. 9 children didn't just appear in the Montana wilderness without a story, and he was beginning to suspect it wasn't a pleasant one. After breakfast, the practical questions began to surface. The youngest ones were drooping with exhaustion, and Sarah had already curled up on his couch, thumb in her mouth. The older children tried to maintain alertness, but Jackson could see the fatigue winning its battle against their vigilance. "You all need rest," he said. "Real rest, in real beds." "We don't want to impose," Lily said quickly. "If you have a barn or something, we can sleep there. We're used to roughing it." The casual reference to sleeping in barns made Jackson's heart clench. "I've got bedrooms upstairs, clean sheets, soft mattresses. No reason for you to sleep rough when there's better available." Marcus studied him suspiciously. "What's the catch?" Jackson met the boy's gaze directly. "No catch, you're children. You're exhausted, and I have empty bedrooms. It's not complicated." "Everything's complicated," Marcus muttered, but Lily placed a restraining hand on his arm. "We accept," she said formally. "Thank you." Leading them upstairs felt strange after months of rattling around the empty house alone. Jackson had avoided the second floor since Mary's death. Too many memories. Too much echo of the family they'd planned to raise in these rooms. But now the silence was broken by the soft murmur of children's voices, the gentle thud of small feet on wooden floors. He showed them to the 3 guest bedrooms, explaining the layout and pointing out clean towels in the linen closet. The children divided themselves efficiently. Lily and the youngest girls in one room, Marcus and the older boys in another, the middle children in the third. They seemed to have protocols for everything, including sleeping arrangements. "Are you sure this is okay?" Lily asked one more time, lingering in the hallway as the others settled into their assigned rooms. Jackson looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the enormous weight she carried. 14 years old and responsible for 8 other lives. Making decisions that could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. Maintaining hope and discipline when the adult world had obviously failed them catastrophically. "It's more than okay," he said quietly. "It's the best thing that's happened in this house for a long time." Something in his tone seemed to reach her. The rigid control she maintained relaxed slightly, and for just a moment, she looked like the child she actually was. "We won't be in any trouble. We know how to take care of ourselves." "I'm sure you do. But maybe it's time you let someone else take care of you for a while." The concept seemed foreign to her. "Adults don't usually ... I'm not like other adults," Jackson said firmly. "Get some sleep. We'll figure out the rest later." As the children settled into their rooms, Jackson found himself facing a reality he hadn't anticipated when he'd planned his morning under the oak tree. 9 human beings now depended on him, at least temporarily. 9 lives that needed food, shelter, protection, and care. The responsibility felt overwhelming and terrifying, but it also felt necessary. He spent the afternoon taking inventory of his situation. The kitchen pantry held enough canned goods and staples for perhaps a week if he rationed carefully. His bank account contained exactly $47.38, enough for one modest grocery run, but certainly not enough to feed 9 growing children for any extended period. The ranch still had some infrastructure that might be useful. The vegetable garden Mary had tended was overgrown but salvageable. The chicken coop stood empty but intact, and he knew where to buy starter birds if he had the money. The old apple orchard behind the house had gone wild, but it still produced fruit in season. More immediately, he had space. The house was large enough to accommodate everyone comfortably, and the outbuildings provided room for expansion if necessary. The Broken Arrow Ranch might be financially ruined, but its bones were still strong. Around 3 in the afternoon, he heard movement upstairs and the quiet murmur of voices. The children were waking up, and he could hear them whispering among themselves, probably trying to orient themselves after sleep. Soon, footsteps on the stairs announced their descent. They appeared in the kitchen looking rumpled but refreshed, their hair mussed and their clothes wrinkled, but their eyes brighter than they'd been that morning. Sarah clung to a battered stuffed rabbit Jackson hadn't noticed before, while Tommy carried what appeared to be a wooden horse that had seen considerable wear. "Feeling better?" Jackson asked. Nods all around, accompanied by shy smiles from the younger ones. But he could see them glancing toward the door, toward the windows, checking their escape routes even in this moment of relative peace. Old habits died hard, especially when those habits had kept you alive. "We should talk," Lily said, her leadership role automatically reasserting itself. "About what happens next." Jackson poured himself a cup of coffee and gestured for them to sit around the kitchen table. It was the same table where he and Mary had shared breakfast every morning for 20 years, where they discussed ranch business and made plans for their future. Now it hosted a very different kind of planning session. "Tell me what you need," Jackson said. The question seemed to surprise them. They exchanged glances, communicating in the wordless way of people who'd learned to depend on each other completely. "A place to stay," Lily began carefully. "Just temporarily, until we can find somewhere permanent." "Food," added Marcus pragmatically. "Safety," whispered Sarah, clutching her rabbit tighter. "To stay together," Tommy said fiercely. "No matter what happens, we don't get split up." Jackson nodded at each item, understanding their priorities. "What about school? Medical care? Legal guardianship?" The questions clearly made them uncomfortable. Lily's jaw tightened, and Marcus shifted restlessly in his chair. "We can't go back into the system," Lily said firmly. "We won't be separated." "The system failed us before," Marcus added bitterly. "We're better off on our own." Jackson was beginning to piece together their story, though they hadn't shared specifics. Foster care, group homes, institutional placement, all the ways society tried to help children who had no families, and all the ways those systems could fail the very people they were meant to protect. "What if there was another way?" he asked slowly. "What if you didn't have to choose between safety and staying together?" "There isn't another way," Marcus said flatly. "We've tried everything. Maybe you haven't tried a ranch in Montana with a man who needs a family as much as you need a home." The words surprised Jackson as much as they surprised the children. He hadn't planned to say them, hadn't even consciously thought them. But as soon as they left his mouth, he knew they were true. These children had appeared at the exact moment he'd given up hope. They'd interrupted his planned ending and forced him to remember that life could have meaning beyond personal happiness. They needed him, and maybe, just maybe, he needed them too. "You don't know us," Lily said quietly. "You don't know what we've done, where we've been, what we might bring with us." "I know you're brave," Jackson replied. "I know you take care of each other. I know you're honest. You could have taken food from my kitchen this morning, but you didn't. You waited and asked permission. That tells me what kind of people you are." "But we're not your responsibility," Lily protested. "You didn't ask for this." Jackson looked around the table at 9 faces showing various mixtures of hope and fear. Children who'd learned not to trust, but who desperately wanted to believe that somewhere in the world, adults could be depended upon. "Maybe that's exactly why it's right," he said. "Maybe the best families aren't the ones you're born into, but the ones that find each other when they need each other most." The kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of Mary's old clock on the wall. Outside, the Montana wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of distant rain and the promise of changes coming, whether they were ready or not. Jackson Hartwell looked at 9 abandoned children sitting around his kitchen table and made a decision that would change all their lives forever. "Stay," he said simply, "not just for a few days. Stay and help me figure out how to make this ranch work again. Stay and be the family I thought I'd lost forever." The weight of the offer settled over them all like a blanket, warm and protective, but also heavy with responsibility and risk. Jackson had just committed to something that might be impossible, and they all knew it, but for the first time since Mary's death, he felt like he had something worth living for. Dawn came, earlier than Jackson had experienced in months, announced not by his usual solitary coffee ritual, but by the soft murmur of children's voices drifting down from the upstairs bedrooms. He lay in his own bed listening to the sounds of life returning to his house, footsteps on floorboards, whispered conversations, the gentle closing of doors. For the first time since Mary's death, the Broken Arrow Ranch felt inhabited rather than haunted. By the time he made it to the kitchen, Lily was already there, standing uncertainly by the stove with her hands clasped behind her back. She'd attempted to tame her tangled hair with water, and someone had found her a clean shirt from somewhere, probably one of the spare clothes Mary had kept for visiting nieces and nephews who never came. "I hope it's okay," she said quickly. "I was trying to start breakfast, but I wasn't sure what you'd want us to use." Jackson looked at the careful preparations. She'd made eggs arranged in a bowl, bacon laid out on a plate, bread sliced and ready for toasting. She'd found the makings of a meal, but hadn't presumed to actually cook it. The consideration behind such restraint spoke volumes about the kind of household training these children had received. "You don't need permission to cook breakfast in your own home," he said, moving to light the stove. "But I appreciate the thought, your own home." The words seemed to echo in the morning air, carrying weight neither of them had expected. Lily's eyes widened slightly, and Jackson realized he'd just made his commitment more concrete than mere words the night before. "I'll teach you how the stove works," he continued, as if offering domestic instruction was the most natural thing in the world. "It's got some quirks you need to know about." The morning cooking lesson became their first real collaboration. Jackson showed Lily how to adjust the gas flame, where to find the good skillets, how to tell when the bacon was properly crispy. She absorbed every detail with intense concentration, asking practical questions about timing and temperature that revealed a sharp mind eager to master useful skills. Back at the group home, she mentioned casually while flipping bacon, "We took turns in the kitchen, but we never got to actually plan meals or really cook. Just follow instructions and clean up after." The reference to a group home confirmed Jackson's suspicions about their background, but he didn't push for details. Instead, he focused on the lesson at hand, showing her how to crack eggs without getting shells in the pan, how to gauge the perfect moment to flip them. By the time the other children appeared, drawn by the aroma of cooking food, Lily had successfully prepared her first complete breakfast. The pride on her face was unmistakable, and Jackson felt something warm unfurl in his chest at her accomplishment. The meal proceeded with more ease than the previous day. The children's natural wariness was gradually giving way to cautious comfort. though Jackson noticed they still automatically scanned exits and maintained their careful spacing around the table. Old habits of survival would take time to fade. After breakfast, Jackson made an announcement that would set the tone for everything that followed. "If you're going to stay here," he said, looking around the table at 9 attentive faces, "you need to understand how a ranch works. This isn't a place where you sit around waiting to be taken care of. Everyone contributes according to their abilities. Everyone learns what they need to know to pull their weight." Marcus leaned forward, his dark eyes alert. "What kind of work?" "All kinds," Jackson replied. "Maintaining buildings, growing food, caring for animals when we get some, fixing things that break. A ranch is like a small city. It takes everyone working together to make it function." "We're not afraid of work," Lily said firmly. "We've been taking care of ourselves for a long time." "I know you have. But ranch work is different from survival. It's about building something that lasts, not just getting through the day." The distinction seemed to resonate with them. These children had mastered the art of immediate survival, but the concept of long-term planning and investment was foreign territory. Jackson's first lesson took them outside to survey the ranch's current state. In the bright morning light, the scope of neglect was even more apparent than it had been during his dark moments under the oak tree. Fence posts leaned at drunken angles, their wires sagging or broken entirely. The barn doors hung askew on rusted hinges. Weeds had claimed the vegetable garden, and the chicken coop showed signs of predator damage. "It looks pretty rough," Tommy observed with typical 8-year-old honesty. "It is rough," Jackson agreed, "but the bones are good. The foundation is solid. With enough work and time, we can bring it back." He led them through a systematic assessment, teaching them to see past the surface decay to the underlying structure. The barn's frame was still sound despite the cosmetic damage. The water well still functioned perfectly. The soil in the garden plot was rich and dark beneath the weeds. Most importantly, the ranch's location provided natural protection from harsh weather and good access to water and grazing land. "The first thing we need to address is food security," Jackson explained as they stood in the overgrown garden. "A ranch feeds itself before it feeds anyone else. That means clearing this space and getting crops in the ground." Emma, the blonde girl with the practical streak, raised her hand like she was in school. "What kind of crops?" "Vegetables first, things that grow fast and produce a lot of food per square foot. Potatoes, beans, squash, tomatoes. Later we can think about corn and wheat if we expand." The next several hours were spent in hands-on education. Jackson demonstrated how to clear weeds without damaging the soil, how to identify which volunteer plants might be worth keeping, how to test dirt consistency and drainage. The children threw themselves into the work with an enthusiasm that surprised him. Marcus proved to have an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems, quickly grasping the principles behind Jackson's explanations of irrigation and drainage. Lily showed natural leadership skills, organizing the younger children into efficient work teams without making anyone feel excluded or overwhelmed. Tommy's endless energy made him perfect for the repetitive task of pulling weeds, while Sarah and the other little ones proved surprisingly effective at detail work, like removing stones and debris. By noon, they had cleared a substantial section of the garden plot. The children were dirty, sweaty, and obviously tired, but their faces showed something Jackson hadn't seen before: genuine satisfaction in productive work. They had accomplished something tangible, something that would directly benefit their daily lives. "Lunch break," Jackson announced, and they trooped back to the house with the easy camaraderie of people who had worked together toward a common goal. The afternoon brought a different kind of lesson. Jackson introduced them to the ranch's financial realities, spreading his account books and bills across the kitchen table with the same matter-of-fact approach he'd used for the garden assessment. "If we're going to make this work," he said, "you need to understand what we're up against." The numbers painted a stark picture. outstanding debts that exceeded the ranch's current value, monthly expenses that far outstripped income, and a foreclosure timeline that gave them perhaps 6 weeks before the bank took possession of everything. "So we're doomed?" Marcus asked bluntly. "Not doomed," Jackson corrected. "Challenged. There's a difference." He showed them historical records from the ranch's profitable years, explaining how the operation had functioned when properly managed. The children listened with the intense focus of people whose survival might depend on understanding every detail. "A working ranch produces multiple income streams," Jackson explained. "Cattle, crops, eggs, milk, sometimes agritourism or hunting leases. The key is diversification and efficiency." "But we don't have cattle," Emma pointed out practically. "Or chickens or any of the other things." "Yet," Jackson replied. "We don't have them yet. But we have something more valuable. We have people willing to work, and we have time to learn how to do it right." The evening brought their first group planning session. Jackson had found a large piece of paper and some colored pencils, and they spread everything out on the living room floor. Together, they began sketching out a recovery plan for the Broken Arrow Ranch. "Phase 1, Lily said, taking naturally to the role of secretary, is food security and basic repairs. Phase 2, Marcus added, is acquiring livestock and establishing income streams. Phase 3, Jackson concluded, is financial stability and long-term sustainability." They spent hours working out details, with even the youngest children contributing ideas. Sarah suggested that they could sell flowers from the wild patch behind the house. Tommy wondered if they could catch fish from the creek and sell them in town. Emma proposed that they learn to preserve food so they wouldn't waste anything during harvest season. Each suggestion was considered seriously and incorporated into their growing plan. Jackson found himself genuinely impressed by their practical thinking and creative problem-solving. These children had learned to see opportunities where others might see only obstacles. The following days established a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Early morning chores in the garden, followed by breakfast and planning discussions. Mid-morning lessons in various ranch skills, basic carpentry, animal husbandry theory, food preservation techniques. Afternoon work sessions on specific projects, with Jackson providing guidance while the children provided energy and enthusiasm. Marcus revealed a gift for mechanical work that went far beyond his years. Give him a broken tool or a malfunctioning piece of equipment, and he could usually diagnose the problem and propose a solution. Jackson began teaching him welding and basic engine repair, skills that would be invaluable as they expanded their operations. Lily's organizational abilities proved essential for managing their complex daily schedule. She created duty rosters that ensured everyone contributed according to their abilities while maintaining the educational component Jackson insisted upon. She also served as the diplomatic interface between the younger children and the adults when conflicts arose. The younger children each found their own niches. Emma's methodical nature made her perfect for record keeping and inventory management. Tommy's fearless curiosity led him to become Jackson's designated scout, exploring every corner of the ranch and reporting back on discoveries and problems. Sarah's gentle touch with growing things made her the unofficial guardian of their seedlings and delicate plants, but perhaps the most significant development was the gradual emergence of trust. The children's defensive behaviors slowly gave way to genuine relaxation. They stopped automatically scanning for exits. They began to argue with each other in the normal way of siblings, rather than maintaining the careful politeness of temporary allies. Most tellingly, they began to take Jackson's presence for granted rather than treating him as a potential threat. The breakthrough moment came during their second week together. Jackson had been teaching Marcus how to repair a section of fence, demonstrating the proper technique for stretching wire and securing posts. The work required two people, one to hold tension while the other fastened the connections. Like this? Marcus asked, adjusting his grip on the wire stretcher. "Perfect," Jackson replied, then added without thinking, "You're getting good at this, son." The words slipped out naturally, without conscious intent, but its impact was immediate. Marcus froze, his eyes widening. For a moment, Jackson thought he'd overstepped, violated some unspoken boundary. Then Marcus smiled, the first completely unguarded expression Jackson had seen from the boy. "Thanks," Marcus said quietly. "I've never been anyone's son before." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Jackson realized that these children had been failed not just by the foster care system, but by the basic concept of family itself. They had learned to depend on each other, but they had never experienced the security of belonging to someone who chose them deliberately. That evening, the conversation around the dinner table took on a different quality. Instead of planning work assignments and discussing ranch business, they began sharing stories about their pasts, not the traumatic details they weren't ready to reveal, but small memories of better times, dreams for the future, silly jokes and observations about their new life. "Mr. Jackson," Sarah said as they finished dessert, wild blackberries Emma had found growing along the creek. "Are we going to stay here forever?" The question caught him off guard. Forever was a concept he'd stopped believing in when Mary died. But looking at 9 faces turned toward him with varying degrees of hope and anxiety, he realized that forever might be exactly what they all needed. "Do you want to stay forever?" he asked. "Yes," came the immediate chorus from around the table. "Then we'll figure out how to make forever work," Jackson promised. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed, Jackson sat on his front porch, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into evening quiet. But it was a different kind of quiet than he'd grown accustomed to, not the oppressive silence of abandonment, but the peaceful hush of a home where people slept safely. Above him, the Montana sky stretched wide and star-filled, the same sky that had witnessed his grandfather's struggles and his father's triumphs, the same sky that had looked down on his darkest moments and his tentative rebirth. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, new steps toward the impossible goal of saving a failed ranch with the help of 9 abandoned children. But tonight, for the first time in months, Jackson Hartwell went to sleep believing that tomorrow might be worth seeing. The Broken Arrow Ranch was coming back to life, and so was he. 3 weeks into their new life together, disaster struck without warning. Jackson woke to the acrid smell of smoke drifting through his bedroom window and the distant sound of crackling flames. His eyes snapped open, immediately alert with the primal fear every rancher carries in his bones. Fire, in a dry climate, could consume everything they'd worked to build in a matter of hours. He threw on clothes and boots, racing downstairs to find the children already stirring, their survival instincts honed by months of constant vigilance. Lily appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale but composed as she took charge of organizing the younger ones. "Everyone stay calm," she called down to Jackson. "What do we need to do?" Through the kitchen window, Jackson could see the orange glow flickering beyond the barn. Not the house, thank God, but close enough to threaten everything they'd been rebuilding. The old hay storage shed, where he'd been keeping the winter feed he couldn't afford to replace, was fully engulfed. "Get everyone dressed and outside," Jackson ordered, grabbing buckets from under the sink. "But stay clear of the barn area until we know it's safe." The next hour tested every lesson they'd learned about working together under pressure. The children formed bucket brigades while Jackson worked frantically to move anything flammable away from the expanding fire. Marcus proved invaluable, his mechanical knowledge helping him quickly disconnect propane tanks and move equipment to safety. Emma took charge of the younger children with surprising authority, keeping them organized and useful without letting them get too close to danger. Tommy and the middle boys ran messages between work teams, their energy channeled into productive communication rather than panic. But it was Sarah who spotted the real crisis. The creek's too low. She called out, her small voice cutting through the chaos. The buckets aren't filling fast enough. Jackson's heart sank as he realized she was right. The late summer drought had reduced their water source to a trickle, barely enough for daily needs, certainly not sufficient for fighting a major fire. The bucket brigade that had seemed like their salvation was drawing up mud and pebbles instead of the water they desperately needed. "We need the neighbors," Lily said, appearing at his elbow with soot streaking her face. Someone with more water, more equipment. Jackson hesitated. In 3 weeks of intensive work, he'd managed to avoid contact with the surrounding community. His shame about the ranch's failure, combined with his uncertainty about how to explain 9 children appearing in his household, had kept him isolated. But now that isolation threatened to cost them everything. "The Hendersons have a well drilling truck," he said finally. "If Bill's willing to help." "I'll go," Marcus volunteered immediately. "I can run fast. Take Tommy with you," Jackson decided. "Henderson Place is 2 miles down the valley road. Tell Bill Hartwell sent you, and we need water pumps. Don't take no for an answer." As the boys disappeared into the darkness, Jackson realized he'd just done something that 3 weeks ago would have been unthinkable. He'd sent kids he'd grown to love into potential danger because the situation demanded it. More than that, he trusted them to handle the responsibility. The transformation in his thinking was so complete he barely recognized himself. The fire continued to spread, despite their efforts, and Jackson began making hard decisions about what to save and what to sacrifice. The hay shed was lost, that was clear, but if they could keep the flames from jumping to the barn, they might still preserve the heart of the ranch's infrastructure. "Jackson!" Lily's voice carried a note of panic. He'd never heard from her before. "The wind's shifting." She was right. The steady breeze that had been pushing the fire away from the main buildings suddenly changed direction, sending sparks and burning debris directly toward the barn's weathered wood siding. In minutes, their defensive efforts would be useless. "Everyone, back to the house," Jackson ordered. "If we can't stop it, we need to protect the people, not the buildings." But Lily stood her ground, bucket in hand, her young face set with stubborn determination. "No, we don't give up. We've worked too hard to let it all burn down." The other children rallied around her decision, forming a new defensive line despite the increasing danger. Jackson felt a surge of pride, so intense it nearly overwhelmed him. These kids had found something worth fighting for, and they weren't about to surrender it without a battle. The sound of truck engines roaring up the drive came just as the first sparks reached the barn siding. Marcus and Tommy had succeeded. Bill Henderson's well-drilling truck rounded the corner with its massive water tank, followed by 2 more vehicles carrying neighbors Jackson hadn't spoken to in months. "Hartwell!" Bill Henderson jumped down from his truck, already unrolling heavy-duty hoses. "Heard you got troubles. Where do you want this water?" The next 20 minutes were a whirlwind of coordinated effort. Professional equipment made quick work of what had seemed like an impossible situation. The barn was saved, the fire contained and extinguished. The immediate crisis ended. But the real test was just beginning. As the flames died down and the immediate danger passed, Jackson found himself facing a circle of neighbors who had questions about the 9 children standing protectively around him. The Henderson family, the Williamses from the next ranch over, old Pete Morrison from the feed store, all people who'd known him his entire life, now staring at a domestic situation that seemed to make no sense. "Jackson," Bill Henderson said carefully, "you want to tell us what's going on here? Because last I heard, you were thinking about selling out and moving on." The moment stretched uncomfortably. Jackson could feel the children's tension, their readiness to run if this encounter went badly. These were adults who could call authorities, ask questions that might tear apart the fragile family they'd been building. But Lily stepped forward before Jackson could speak, her chin raised with quiet dignity despite the soot streaking her face and the exhaustion weighing on her small frame. Mr. Jackson took us in when we had nowhere else to go, she said clearly. We're helping him fix up the ranch. We're not causing trouble for anyone. Took you in from where? Mrs. Williams asked, her voice not unkind but definitely concerned. Are your parents? We don't have parents, Marcus said bluntly, moving to stand beside Lily. We have each other, and we have Jackson. That's all we need. Jackson saw the neighbors exchanging glances, saw the mixture of confusion and concern on their faces. These were good people who would feel obligated to report what they saw if they thought children were in danger. But they were also practical. Ranchers who understood that sometimes unconventional solutions were the only ones that worked. The children are staying with me, Jackson said finally, making the decision to trust these people who dropped everything to help him fight the fire. It's not temporary, they're family now. Family doesn't just happen overnight, Jackson, Pete Morrison observed, his weathered face creased with worry. There's legal considerations, social services, all kinds of complications. Sometimes family happens exactly as fast as it needs to, Jackson replied. These kids need a home. I need a purpose. The math isn't complicated. Sarah, tired beyond her limits and overwhelmed by the presence of so many strange adults, began to cry quietly. Without hesitation, Jackson scooped her up, settling her against his shoulder with the natural ease of someone who'd been caring for children all his life. The gesture wasn't lost on the assembled neighbors. Bill Henderson's expression softened as he watched Jackson comfort the little girl with obvious affection and practiced skill. How long have they been here? Bill asked. 3 weeks, Jackson answered honestly. Best 3 weeks I've had since Mary died. Mrs. Williams stepped closer, her maternal instincts clearly engaged as she looked at the exhausted children. They look thin, she observed. And those clothes have seen better days. We're working on it, Jackson said. Takes time to get a proper household running. Takes money too, Pete Morrison added practically. Word around town is you're facing foreclosure. The blunt statement hung in the air like smoke from the extinguished fire. Jackson felt the children tense around him, suddenly aware that their newfound security might be even more fragile than they'd imagined. We're working on that too, he said quietly. Bill Henderson studied the group with the calculating gaze of a man who'd spent his life solving practical problems. You know, Jackson, there's been talk in town about that old cattle cooperative your daddy helped start. Some of us been thinking it might be time to revive something like that. Cooperative buying, shared equipment, maybe some joint marketing. Mrs. Williams added thoughtfully. Could help everyone stretch their dollars further. Jackson understood what they were offering, a lifeline that wouldn't feel like charity, a way to generate the income he needed while providing value to his neighbors. It was exactly the kind of creative solution these children had been teaching him to see. What would something like that look like? He asked. The next hour was spent in impromptu planning, with neighbors sketching out possibilities, while the children listened with the intense focus of people whose future hung on every word. The concept was simple but promising: pool resources. For major purchases, coordinate planting and harvesting to maximize efficiency. Create shared marketing channels that could command better prices. Your place would be perfect for the equipment storage, Bill suggested. Central location, good access, plenty of space. We could pay you a management fee, help with your cash flow situation. And these young folks, Pete Morrison added, glancing at the children with growing respect, they seemed to have good heads on their shoulders. Cooperative could use some help with record keeping, maintenance work, general labor during busy seasons. Jackson felt a spark of hope brighter than any flame. This wasn't just a solution to his immediate financial crisis. It was a sustainable, long-term plan that could provide security for all of them. But the children had been silent too long, and he could sense their anxiety despite the encouraging direction of the conversation. What do you think? He asked them directly. Would you be interested in that kind of work? We'd do anything to help the ranch succeed. Lily said immediately. But ... Bill quote. But what? Marcus voiced what they were all thinking. What if people find out about us? What if someone decides we shouldn't be here? The question addressed the elephant in the room: 9 children living with a single man. No legal documentation, no official oversight. In other circumstances, it would be exactly the kind of situation that triggered investigations and interventions. Bill Henderson cleared his throat. Way I see it, he said slowly, Jackson's got a big place here, lot of work that needs doing. Makes sense he'd need help. Makes sense he'd provide room and board in exchange for that help. Apprenticeship program, Mrs. Williams added, catching on to the direction of his thinking. Teaching practical skills, providing education and training. Lots of ranches do that kind of thing. Course, proper apprenticeship program would need some structure, Pete Morrison observed. Documentation, educational components, maybe some oversight from people who know what they're talking about. Jackson began to understand what his neighbors were offering, not just economic partnership, but social protection. A legitimate framework that could shelter the unconventional family they'd created. You'd be willing to help with something like that? He asked. Jackson, your daddy helped half the families in this valley get started, Bill replied. Your family's been good neighbors for 3 generations. Time we returned the favor. As the neighbors packed up their equipment and prepared to leave, the children gathered around Jackson with expressions of amazement and cautious hope. They'd witnessed something completely foreign to their experience. Adults working together to solve problems instead of creating them, community support instead of institutional indifference. They're really going to help us? Tommy asked, his voice filled with wonder. Looks that way, Jackson confirmed. Why? Sarah asked, the question that was on all their minds. Jackson thought about the answer, about the complex web of obligation and affection that tied rural communities together. About the way shared hardship created bonds stronger than blood, and how helping others ultimately helped yourself. Because that's what neighbors do, he said finally. And because we've proven we're worth helping. The fire had destroyed the hayshed and scattered their carefully laid plans, but it had also accomplished something unexpected. It had forced Jackson to reveal their situation to the community and discover that the support they needed had been available all along. More importantly, it showed the children that they could depend not just on each other, but on the network of relationships that made survival possible in a hard country. They had passed their first real test as a family, and they had emerged stronger than before. As they walked back toward the house through the smoke-scented darkness, Marcus fell into step beside Jackson. That was scary, the boy admitted quietly. Yes, it was, Jackson agreed, but you handled it perfectly. You all did. I've never had adults just show up to help before, Marcus continued. Usually when adults show up, it means something bad is about to happen. Jackson stopped walking and turned to face the boy who'd become like a son to him. Marcus, I want you to remember tonight. I want you to remember that there are good people in the world, people who'll drop everything to help when help is needed. And I want you to remember that you're one of those people now too. The boy nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of what Jackson was telling him. They were no longer just survivors taking whatever they could get. They were community members with obligations and opportunities, people who belonged somewhere and had something valuable to contribute. The transformation test was complete. They had faced crisis together, made hard decisions under pressure, and emerged not just intact but stronger. The Broken Arrow Ranch was becoming more than just a place to hide from the world. It was becoming home. The black sedan appeared on the horizon like a storm cloud, its sleek government-issued form standing out starkly against the rugged Montana landscape. Jackson spotted it first from where he was repairing fence posts with Marcus, the distant glint of chrome catching his eye as the vehicle navigated the winding dirt road that led to the Broken Arrow Ranch. Asterisk. Company coming, he said quietly, setting Down his post-hole digger and shading his eyes against the afternoon sun, Marcus followed his gaze, and Jackson saw the boy's entire body tense with recognition and fear. "That's a state car," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Child Services." The words hit Jackson like a physical blow. After 6 weeks of building their new life together, after the community support they'd received following the fire, after everything they'd accomplished, the outside world had finally caught up with them. "Get the others," Jackson said, his mind already racing through possibilities and responses. Quietly. "Don't panic, but get everyone to the house, now." Marcus sprinted toward the vegetable garden where Lily was supervising the afternoon harvest with the younger children. Jackson watched him speak urgently to his sister, saw her face pale as she processed the information, then witnessed the controlled efficiency with which she organized the evacuation of their workspace. Within minutes, all 9 children had assembled. In the ranch house kitchen, their faces showing varying degrees of fear and defiance. They'd been through this before, Jackson realized. They knew what government intervention looked like, and they knew it rarely ended well for children like them. "Listen to me," Jackson said, keeping his voice calm and authoritative despite the churning in his stomach. "Whatever happens, we tell the truth. We're a family, we belong together. We've built something good here, and we're not ashamed of it." "They'll separate us," Sarah whispered, clutching her stuffed rabbit so tightly her knuckles showed white. "They always separate us." "Not this time," Jackson said firmly. "I won't let that happen." Lily looked at him with eyes that seemed far too old for her 14 years. "Mr. Jackson, you don't understand what these people can do. They have legal authority. They can take us no matter what you say. Then we'll make sure they understand that taking you would be the wrong decision," Jackson replied. "We have community support now. We have witnesses to what we've accomplished. We have proof that this arrangement works." The sedan pulled into the ranch yard, followed by a second vehicle, a county sheriff's cruiser that made Jackson's heart sink even further. This wasn't just a routine welfare check. This was a planned intervention with law enforcement. Backup. 3 people emerged from the vehicles. A stern-faced woman in a business suit carrying a thick folder, a younger man with the earnest expression of a social worker, and Deputy Tom Reynolds, whom Jackson had known since high school. The fact that they'd sent Tom was either a good sign local law enforcement who might be sympathetic, or a very bad one, someone who knew Jackson well enough to understand exactly how irregular this situation was. "You all stay calm," Jackson instructed the children. "Let me handle this first. If they want to talk to you, answer honestly, but don't volunteer information they don't ask for." He stepped out onto the front porch to meet the delegation, automatically positioning himself between the officials and the house, where 9 frightened children waited for their world to potentially collapse again. "Jackson," Deputy Reynolds nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "This is Ms. Patricia Hoffman from the State Department of Family Services, and Daniel Wu, County Social Worker. They need to ask you some questions." Ms. Hoffman stepped forward, her manner brisk and professional. "Mr. Hartwell, we've received reports that you're housing multiple minor children without proper legal authorization. We need to conduct a welfare assessment and determine the status of these children." "The children are fine," Jackson said evenly. "They're safe, well-fed, properly housed, and receiving education and care. You're welcome to verify that for yourselves." "Mr. Hartwell," the social worker, Wu said, "we understand you may have good intentions, but there are legal procedures for child placement. These children appear to be missing from the system, and we have protocols we must follow." "Missing from a system that failed them," Jackson replied. "These kids came to me because they had nowhere else to go. They've thrived here. They've become productive, confident, healthy children with a stable home environment." Ms. Hoffman consulted her folder. "According to our records, 9 children disappeared from various group homes and foster placements over the past 4 months. Their cases were flagged as potential runaways or abductions. We have a legal obligation to return them to proper custody. Proper custody? Jackson's voice hardened. You mean the same system they ran away from? The same placements that were so inadequate these children chose to live on the streets rather than stay there? Mr. Hartwell, Deputy Reynolds interjected, nobody's questioning your motives here. But there are laws about child custody, and you can't just decide to take in 9 kids without going through proper channels. Jackson felt his temper rising, but he forced himself to remain calm. Losing control now would only confirm their preconceptions about his unsuitability as a guardian. Then let's talk about proper channels, he said. I want to adopt these children. All of them. I want to go through whatever legal process is necessary to make this arrangement permanent and official. The 3 officials exchanged glances. Ms. Hoffman made a note in her folder. Mr. Hartwell, adoption requires extensive background checks, home studies, financial assessments, and approval from multiple agencies. It's a lengthy process, and there's no guarantee of approval, especially for multiple children. Then we start the process today, Jackson said firmly. But the children stay here while we work through it. They're not going back to institutional placement. I'm afraid that's not possible, Ms. Hoffman replied. Until proper custody is established, these children must be returned to state care. Over my dead body. The voice came from behind Jackson, and he turned to see Lily standing in the doorway, her small frame radiating fierce determination. The other children had gathered behind her, presenting a united front despite their obvious fear. Young lady. Ms. Hoffman addressed Lily directly. I understand this situation may be confusing for you, but we're here to help. We're going to make sure you're placed in appropriate care with qualified families. We already have a family, Marcus said, stepping forward to stand beside Lily. And we're already in appropriate care. Mr. Jackson takes better care of us than anyone ever has. Children, Wu spoke in the patient tone social workers used when they thought they were dealing with traumatized kids who didn't understand their own best interests. Sometimes adults can seem kind and caring, but that doesn't mean they're qualified to provide proper guardianship. There are trained professionals put me in a home where the foster father tried to touch me inappropriately. Lily interrupted, her voice cutting like ice. Trained professionals placed Marcus with a family that used him as unpaid labor and fed him scraps. Trained professionals separated me from my little sister for 8 months because there wasn't a placement that could take us together. Jackson felt his heart break as he heard these details for the first time. The children had endured horrors he'd only suspected, and they'd never felt safe enough to share the full extent of their suffering. We're not going back, Tommy declared, his 8-year-old voice shaking but determined. We belong here. This is our home. Ms. Hoffman's professional composure cracked slightly. I understand you may have had negative experiences in the past, but that doesn't mean— Ma'am, Deputy Reynolds interrupted. Maybe we should look at the actual situation here before we make any decisions about moving these kids. Jackson shot Tom a grateful glance. The deputy's intervention suggested he might be more sympathetic than Jackson had dared hope. Of course, Ms. Hoffman agreed, though her tone suggested she considered it a formality. We'll need to inspect the living conditions, interview the children separately, and assess the overall environment. The next 2 hours were the longest of Jackson's life. He watched as the officials examined every corner of his house, checked the children's sleeping arrangements, inspected the kitchen and bathroom facilities, and questioned the children about their daily routines, their health, their education, and their treatment. The children answered honestly but selectively, confirming that they were well fed, safely housed, and properly cared for, but providing minimal details about their past experiences or their feelings about their current situation. Jackson could see them using survival skills learned through years of navigating the system, giving authorities what they wanted to hear while protecting the information that really mattered. But it was Emma who finally broke through the officials. Professional skepticism. "Ma'am," she said to Ms. Hoffman during her individual interview, "I know you think we don't understand what's best for us because we're children. But I'm 12 years old, and I've been in 14 different placements since I was 6. I know what good care looks like, and I know what it feels like to be unwanted." Jackson, listening from the next room, felt his throat tighten at the matter-of-fact way she delivered these devastating statistics. "Here," Emma continued, "I have my own space, but I'm not isolated. I have chores, but they're meaningful work that helps our family succeed. I have rules, but they make sense, and they're applied fairly. Most importantly, I have people who chose me, not because they get paid to take care of me, but because they want me to be part of their lives." "Emma," Ms. Hoffman's voice had softened, "what would you say if I told you we could find you a placement? With a nice family that wanted to adopt you permanently?" "I'd say I already have that," Emma replied without hesitation. "And I'd ask why you want to take me away from it." The question hung in the air unanswered. When the interviews were complete, the officials huddled together in the ranch yard for what felt like hours. Jackson watched through the kitchen window as they engaged in intense discussion, occasionally consulting paperwork and making phone calls. The children waited in tense silence, holding hands in a chain that connected them all. Finally, Deputy Reynolds approached the house alone. "Jackson," he said, "can I speak with you privately?" They walked out to the front porch, away from listening ears. Tom Reynolds had been 2 years behind Jackson in school, had played football with his younger brother, had attended Jackson and Mary's wedding. If anyone would understand the situation, it would be him. "Tom, these kids—" "I know," Reynolds interrupted. "I can see what you've built here. Hell, half the county's been talking about it since the fire. But Jackson, you've got to understand the position these people are in. 9 children with no legal status, living with a single man who has no official custody rights. It looks bad on paper, but not in reality," Jackson insisted. "You've seen them. You've talked to them. They're thriving. I know that. You know that. But the state has procedures, and those procedures exist for good reasons. There are predators out there who would love to get their hands on vulnerable children, and the system is designed to prevent that." Jackson felt a surge of anger. "So the solution is to punish the children for finding safety? To destroy a family that actually works because it doesn't fit bureaucratic guidelines?" "Nobody wants to punish anyone," Reynolds said. "But there has to be a middle ground here. Some way to make this legal while keeping the family together. What are you suggesting?" "Ms. Hoffman's on the phone with her supervisor right now. There might be options: emergency custody arrangements, expedited adoption procedures, something that lets you keep the kids while you work through the legal requirements." Hope flickered in Jackson's chest. What would that look like? Probably court supervision, regular check-ins, maybe some temporary guardianship arrangements while the adoption process moves forward. It wouldn't be quick or easy, but it might be possible. Before Jackson could respond, Ms. Hoffman approached them, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, "I've spoken with my supervisor and the county attorney. Given the unusual circumstances of this case, and considering the children's clear preference to remain here, we're prepared to offer an alternative to immediate removal." Jackson held his breath. "We can arrange for emergency temporary custody to be granted to you, pending a full investigation and adoption proceedings. This would require court appearances, home studies, background checks, and regular supervision visits. You would need to demonstrate financial stability and complete parenting classes. The children would remain here during this process, but any violation of the terms would result in immediate removal." "I'll take it," Jackson said without hesitation. "Mr. Hartwell," Ms. Hoffman continued, I want to be clear about something. This is highly irregular. The only reason we're considering this arrangement is because these children have already been failed by the system multiple times, and because the evidence suggests they are genuinely better off here than they would be in institutional care. I understand. There will be paperwork. Lots of paperwork. Court dates, interviews, home inspections, financial disclosures, educational assessments. The process could take months or even years to complete. We'll handle whatever is necessary, Jackson said. Ms. Hoffman studied him for a long moment. Mr. Hartwell, why do you want to do this? 9 children is an enormous responsibility. You could have a much easier life if you let us place them in other homes. Jackson thought about the question, about the man he'd been 6 weeks ago standing under the oak tree with a rope around his neck. About 9 scared children appearing like a miracle at the exact moment he'd needed them most. About the family they built through hard work and mutual care. Because they saved my life, he said simply. And because every child deserves to belong somewhere. Ms. Hoffman nodded slowly. We'll begin the paperwork immediately. I'll need you to come to the county courthouse tomorrow morning to start the custody proceedings. As the officials prepared to leave, the children clustered around Jackson with expressions of cautious relief mixed with lingering fear. They'd won this battle, but they all understood it was just the first of many they would face. Is it over? Sarah asked, her small hand slipping into Jackson's. It's just beginning, Jackson replied honestly. But we're going to face it together, as a family. Lily looked up at him with eyes that held the wisdom of someone who'd learned not to trust promises too easily. What if they change their minds? What if something goes wrong? Jackson knelt down so he could look her in the eye. Then we'll deal with whatever comes. But Lily, I want you to understand something. I'm not giving up on any of you. Ever. Whatever it takes. However long it takes. We're going to make this legal and permanent. You promise? Tommy asked. Jackson looked around at 9 faces that had become as precious to him as his own heartbeat. Children who'd taught him that family wasn't about blood or legal documents, but about choosing each other every day and refusing to let go. I promise, he said. We're family now. Nothing's going to change that. As they watched the government vehicles disappear down the valley road, Jackson realized that this confrontation had accomplished something unexpected. Instead of destroying their family, it had made it stronger by forcing them to defend what they'd built. They'd faced the system that had failed them all, and they'd emerged not just intact, but officially recognized. The real battle was just beginning. But for the first time since this all started, Jackson felt confident they were going to win. Broken Arrow Ranch had faced its greatest threat and survived. Now it was time to make their miracle permanent. 6 months later, Judge Margaret Chun's courtroom buzzed with an energy that felt more like a community celebration than a legal proceeding. The formal adoption hearing for Jackson Hartwell and his 9 children had drawn what seemed like half of Cedar Falls, Montana, creating an atmosphere that was equal parts nervous anticipation and joyful expectation. Jackson adjusted his tie for the 3rd time, still uncomfortable in the formal suit he'd purchased specifically for this occasion. Beside him, 9 children sat in a row, each dressed in their finest clothes, some borrowed, some purchased new with help from neighbors, all worn with the particular pride of people who understood the significance of the moment. The past months had been a whirlwind of paperwork, interviews, home inspections, and court appearances. Jackson had navigated bureaucratic mazes that would have challenged a team of lawyers, while simultaneously managing the daily requirements of running a ranch with 9 children. There had been moments when the legal process seemed designed to exhaust applicants into giving up, but Jackson had persevered with the stubborn determination that had kept the Hartwell family on this land for 3 generations. The children had faced their own challenges during the process. Each had been required to undergo psychological evaluations, educational assessments, and individual interviews with court-appointed advocates. They'd been questioned about their past experiences, their current living situation, and their feelings about permanent placement with Jackson. Through it all, they had remained united in their conviction that they belonged together as a family. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Judge Shun entered the courtroom. The Honorable Margaret Chin presiding. Judge Chen was a small woman with steel-gray hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the packed courtroom. She'd presided over hundreds of adoption cases during her 20-year career, but Jackson sensed that this one was special even by her standards. "Please, be seated," Judge Chin said, settling behind her bench and opening the thick file that contained their case. "We're here today for the final adoption hearing in the matter of Jackson Hartwell petitioning to adopt 9 minor children currently in his care under emergency custody arrangements." She looked out over the courtroom, her gaze taking in the sea of supportive faces, neighbors, community members, and local officials who had come to witness this moment. "Before we proceed," Judge Shun continued, "I want to acknowledge that this is an unusual case in many respects. Rarely do we see a single petitioner seeking to adopt 9 children simultaneously. Even more rarely do we see such overwhelming community support for an adoption proceeding." Jackson felt a flutter of nervousness. Judge Chen's tone was impossible to read, and he couldn't tell whether her comments were leading toward approval or concern. "Over the past 6 months," the judge continued, "this court has conducted extensive investigations into the circumstances of this case. We have reviewed home studies, financial assessments, psychological evaluations, educational reports, and community references. We have interviewed the petitioner, the children, and numerous members of the community." She paused, consulting her notes. "We have also reviewed the extensive documentation of the children's previous placements and the circumstances that led them to their current situation." Jackson's lawyer, Patricia Wells, a sharp woman who specialized in family law and had donated her services pro bono, leaned forward slightly. She'd warned Jackson that Judge Chin liked to build dramatic tension before delivering her rulings, but the waiting was excruciating. "Mr. Hartwell," Judge Chin addressed Jackson directly. "Please stand." Jackson rose, his heart pounding. Beside him, he could feel the children tense with anxiety. "Sir, when you first took these children into your home, you were facing foreclosure. On your ranch, struggling with grief over the loss of your wife, and by your own admission, contemplating ending your own life. What convinced you that you were capable of caring for 9 traumatized children?" The question was direct and challenging, exactly the kind Judge Sheen was known for. Jackson had prepared for this moment, but standing in the formal courtroom with everyone's attention focused on him, he found himself speaking from the heart rather than from any rehearsed response. "Your Honor," he began, "I think it was the other way around. These children convinced me that I was worth saving. They showed up at the exact moment I had given up hope, and they gave me a reason to keep fighting. They didn't need me to be perfect, they needed me to be present, to care about their welfare, and to refuse to give up on them the way other adults had." Judge Chun nodded thoughtfully. "And what makes you believe this arrangement is in the children's best interests, given the trauma they've experienced in institutional settings?" "Because they're thriving, Your Honor. Not just surviving, but actually thriving. They're healthy, happy, well-educated, and productive members of our community. They've learned skills that will serve them their entire lives. And more importantly, they've learned that they have value and that they deserve love and stability." "Lily Rodriguez," Judge Chen called, and Lily stood gracefully, her posture straight and confident. "As the eldest of the group, you've essentially served as a parental figure to the younger children for some time. How do you feel about Mr. Hartwell legally becoming your father?" Lily's voice was clear and strong when she answered, "Your Honor, Mr. Jackson didn't just give us a place to live. He gave us a chance to be children instead of just survivors. For the first time in my life, I don't have to worry about where we'll sleep tomorrow or whether we'll have enough food. I can focus on learning and growing instead of just trying to keep everyone safe." She paused, glancing back at her siblings with obvious affection. But most importantly, he kept us together. Every other adult who tried to help us wanted to split us up, put us in different homes, separate us from each other. Mr. Jackson understood that we're a family, and he helped us become an even stronger family. Judge Chun made notes as Lily spoke, then called on Marcus. "Marcus Washington, you've been particularly vocal about your distrust of adult authority figures. Has that changed during your time with Mr. Hartwell?" Marcus stood, and Jackson could see the effort it took for the boy to speak in such a formal setting. "Your Honor, I've learned that there are adults who keep their promises. Mr. Jackson said he wouldn't give up on us. And he didn't, even when the legal process got complicated and expensive. He said we were family, and he proved it by fighting for us when it would have been easier to let us go." "And the younger children?" Judge Chun asked. "Sarah Mitchell, would you like to tell me how you feel about this adoption?" Sarah rose on unsteady legs, clutching her stuffed rabbit. At 7 years old, she was the youngest of the group, and speaking in court clearly terrified her. But when she opened her mouth, her words were perfectly clear. "I love my daddy Jackson," she said, simply. "And I love my brothers and sisters. I want to stay with them forever." The courtroom stirred with emotion at her straightforward declaration. Judge Chun's expression softened noticeably. "Tommy Nelson," she called next. "You've made remarkable academic progress during your time with Mr. Hartwell. Tell me about your education." Tommy stood eagerly, his red hair neatly combed for the occasion. "Your Honor, Mr. Jackson got us enrolled in the local school, but he also teaches us ranch work and practical skills. I can fix engines and build fences and grow vegetables. But I'm also reading at a 6th grade level now, which is 2 grades ahead of where I was before." Judge Shin nodded approvingly. "And you enjoy this combination of academic and practical education?" "Yes, ma'am. It makes everything feel connected, like what I learn in school helps me understand the ranch work. And the ranch work helps me understand what I learn in school." One by one, Judge Chun questioned each of the children. Emma spoke about the security of having consistent rules and expectations. David talked about learning responsibility through caring for the ranch animals they'd acquired. Rachel described the joy of having her own space while still being part of a larger family. James explained how the ranch work had helped him channel his energy in positive directions. Each testimony painted a picture of children who had found not just safety, but genuine happiness and opportunity for growth. "Mr. Hartwell," Judge Chun said, returning her attention to Jackson, "the financial reports show that your ranch has become profitable again over the past 6 months. How did you accomplish this transformation?" Jackson smiled, thinking about the community cooperative that had emerged from the crisis of the fire. "Your Honor, it turns out that having 9 children provides excellent motivation for finding creative solutions to problems. We partnered with neighboring ranches to form a cooperative that shares equipment and coordinates marketing. The children provide labor in exchange for learning opportunities, and we've diversified our income streams to include vegetable production, equipment maintenance services, and agricultural education programs." "And you're confident this financial stability will continue?" "Yes, Your Honor. We've built something sustainable that benefits not just our family, but the entire community. The children are partners in this operation, not just dependents. They have skin in the game." Judge Chun consulted her notes extensively, the silence stretching until Jackson wondered if something had gone wrong. Finally she looked up, her expression grave. "I've been a family court judge for 20 years, she began, "and I've seen every conceivable variation of family structure, custody arrangement, and adoption scenario. I've seen loving families torn apart by bureaucracy, and I've seen well-intentioned placements that failed to serve the children's best interests. Jackson's heart sank. The tone sounded ominous. But I have never, Judge Shin continued, seen a more compelling case for the power of chosen family and unconventional love. Mr. Hartwell, the evidence is overwhelming that these children are better off with you than they would be in any alternative placement. Your commitment to their welfare, education, and emotional development has been exemplary. She turned her attention to the children. And you 9 have shown remarkable maturity, resilience, and dedication to each other and to your chosen father. You've proven that family is defined not by biology, but by love, commitment, and mutual support. Judge Chun picked up her gavel, and Jackson held his breath. Therefore, it is the order of this court that the petition for adoption is granted in full. Jackson Hartwell, you are hereby recognized as the legal father of Lily Rodriguez Hartwell, Marcus Washington Hartwell, Emma Clark Hartwell, Tommy Nelson Hartwell, Sarah Mitchell Hartwell, David Brooks Hartwell, Rachel Torres Hartwell, James Parker Hartwell, and Anna Kim Hartwell. The gavel came down with a decisive bang, and the courtroom erupted in applause and cheers. Jackson felt his knees go weak with relief and joy, while the children around him burst into tears and laughter simultaneously. Congratulations to the Hartwell family, Judge Shun said over the noise, her own eyes suspiciously bright. May you continue to thrive together. The next hour was a blur of congratulations, photographs, and paperwork. The children were officially presented with their new birth certificates bearing the Hartwell name, a moment that felt like watching them claim their rightful place in the world. But it was the quiet moment afterward, when they'd returned to the ranch and gathered around the kitchen table for a celebratory dinner, that truly marked their transformation. So, Jackson said, looking around at 9 faces that now legally belonged to his family, what do we do now? Now we keep being a family. Lily said simply, just like we have been, except now it's official. Now I can tell people at school that you're really my dad, Tommy added excitedly. Not just pretend dad, but actual dad. Now we belong somewhere, Marcus said quietly, and Jackson heard in his voice the wonder of someone who had never experienced that security before. As they sat around the table sharing stories and making plans for the future, Jackson thought about the morning 6 months ago when he'd stood under the oak tree with a rope around his neck, convinced that his life had no purpose or meaning. The transformation was so complete it felt like remembering someone else's life. The Broken Arrow Ranch had become more than just a working operation. It was a symbol of what was possible when people refused to give up on each other. The house that had echoed with loneliness now rang with laughter and conversation. The land that had seemed like a burden now represented opportunity and hope. Most importantly, 9 children who had been discarded by the system had found their place in the world, and a broken man had discovered that healing came not from forgetting pain, but from choosing to love again despite the risk. Later that evening, as Jackson tucked the younger children into their beds, a ritual that had become as natural as breathing, Sarah looked up at him with serious eyes. Daddy Jackson, she said, testing out the new official title, are you happy we found you? Jackson thought about the question, about the miraculous chain of events that had brought them all together at exactly the moment when they'd all needed each other most. Sarah, he said, finding you all was the best thing that ever happened. To me, you saved my life and you gave me a reason to keep living. You saved us too, she replied with the simple wisdom of childhood. We saved each other. As Jackson made his final rounds through the house, checking locks and turning off lights, he paused in the living room where Mary's photograph still held a place of honor on the mantelpiece. He'd worried initially that the children might feel uncomfortable with reminders of his first marriage, but they'd embraced Mary's memory as part of their family's history. I think you'd approve, he said quietly to the photograph. They're good kids, Mary. They would have loved you, and I know you would have loved them. Outside, The Montana sky stretched wide and star-filled above the Broken Arrow Ranch, the same sky that had witnessed his grandfather's dreams and his father's struggles, that had looked down on his darkest hour and his greatest triumph. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There were always challenges in ranch life, but now he had 9 reasons to face whatever came with hope, instead of despair. The ranch that had nearly died with him had been reborn as something stronger and more vital than ever before. And the man who had given up on living had discovered that sometimes the best families were the ones that found each other when they needed each other most. The Broken Arrow Ranch was whole again, and so was Jackson Hartwell. But more than that, they had created something entirely new, a family forged not by accident of birth, but by deliberate choice and unshakable love. The months following the adoption brought changes that none of them could have anticipated. The ranch cooperative that had begun as a desperate solution to foreclosure had evolved into a model program that attracted attention from agricultural colleges and rural development agencies. Delegations of farmers and social workers visited regularly to study their unique combination of family farming and therapeutic child care. Jackson found himself speaking at conferences about alternative family structures and innovative agricultural practices. The shy, broken man who had once hidden from his neighbors was now sharing his story with audiences across the state, explaining how the combination of purposeful work and unconditional love could transform both land and lives. The secret, he would tell these audiences, isn't that we're special people doing impossible things. It's that we stopped thinking about what we couldn't do and started focusing on what we could do together. The children, too, had become inadvertent ambassadors for their unconventional family. Their academic achievements drew attention from educators studying the benefits of combining classroom learning with practical skills. Marcus's mechanical innovations had earned him recognition from the state's Young Inventors Program. Lily's organizational leadership had made her a sought-after speaker at youth conferences about overcoming adversity. But perhaps the most meaningful changes were the smallest ones, visible only to those who lived them daily. Emma had started a small business selling preserves made from their garden produce, her methodical nature perfectly suited to the precise requirements of canning and food safety. Her success had inspired other children to explore their own entrepreneurial interests. Tommy had begun breeding rabbits, both for meat and for the therapy program they'd started for visiting children from group homes. David had discovered a gift for working with troubled animals, particularly horses that had been abandoned or abused. His patient, gentle approach had made him the unofficial veterinary assistant for several neighboring ranches, and he'd begun talking about studying animal science in college. Rachel's artistic talents had flourished in the stable environment of the ranch. Her paintings and drawings of ranch life had been featured in local art shows, and she'd been commissioned to create a mural for the Cedar Falls Community Center, depicting the area's agricultural heritage. James, the boy who'd once struggled with anger and impulse control, had become their most dedicated student of sustainable farming practices. His research into soil conservation and water management was helping the entire cooperative improve their environmental stewardship. Anna, the quietest of the group, had revealed an extraordinary talent for music. Jackson had found an old piano at an estate sale and spent months refurbishing it with Marcus's help. Now Anna's playing filled the house in the evenings, her compositions capturing the rhythms and emotions of ranch life in ways that spoke to everyone who heard them. The ranch itself had become a testament to what was possible when vision combined with determination. The vegetable gardens now fed not only their large family, but supplied produce to restaurants in 3 counties. The livestock operation had expanded to include not just cattle and chickens, but also goats, sheep, and the horses that David worked with. Most remarkably, they had begun accepting other children, not for adoption, but for temporary stays that gave them respite from institutional settings while providing additional hands for ranch work. These visiting children learned practical skills while experiencing what stable family life could look like. Many maintained contact long after their visits ended, treating the Broken Arrow Ranch as a touchstone of possibility in their own difficult journeys. The success hadn't come without challenges. There were still moments of conflict, episodes of regression when the children's traumatic pasts resurfaced, financial pressures when equipment broke down or markets fluctuated. Jackson had learned to navigate teenage drama multiplied by 9, to balance individual needs with family responsibilities, to maintain authority while encouraging independence. But these challenges felt manageable in ways that his previous struggles never had. When problems arose, they faced them as a unit, drawing on the collective wisdom and strength they'd built together. The children who had once trusted only each other now understood that they could depend on adult support when they needed it. The community's role in their success couldn't be overstated. The Henderson family had become honorary grandparents, providing guidance and support that helped Jackson navigate the complexities of raising 9 children. Mrs. Williams had organized a network of community members who provided mentorship in various skills and career interests. The local school district had created specialized programs that accommodated the children's unique needs and backgrounds. Even more importantly, the success of the Broken Arrow Ranch had inspired other communities to examine their own approaches to child welfare and family support. Several other counties had begun pilot programs combining agricultural work with foster care, creating environments where children could heal while contributing to their own success. On quiet Sunday mornings, when chores were finished and the family gathered for breakfast, Jackson often marveled at the transformation that surrounded him. The kitchen table that had once been a place of solitary despair now hosted animated discussions about everything from livestock genetics to college applications to weekend plans for camping trips in the mountains. The children had grown not just physically but emotionally, developing the confidence that came from knowing they were valued and secure. They argued with him about curfews and responsibilities in the normal way of teenagers, no longer afraid that expressing disagreement would result in abandonment. They brought friends home from school, proud to show off their unique family and the ranch they'd helped build. Jackson had learned to see their behavioral challenges as normal developmental issues rather than evidence of permanent damage. When Marcus tested boundaries, Jackson recognized it as healthy adolescent independence rather than rejection of authority. When Lily occasionally tried to resume her role as primary caretaker for the younger children, Jackson gently redirected her toward age-appropriate responsibilities while acknowledging her natural leadership abilities. The financial transformation had been equally remarkable. The ranch that had once faced foreclosure now operated profitably across multiple income streams. The cooperative model had proven so successful that neighboring properties were achieving better yields and higher profits through shared resources and coordinated planning. Jackson had been able to set aside college funds for all 9 children, ensuring that their education would continue beyond high school, regardless of their career choices. Some, like Marcus, were drawn toward technical fields that would benefit from formal engineering training. Others, like David, wanted to pursue agricultural sciences. Rachel had been accepted into a prestigious art program, while Lily showed interest in social work and youth advocacy. But the most profound change was in Jackson himself. The man who had stood under the oak tree with a rope around his neck had discovered reserves of strength, patience, and love he never knew he possessed. Fatherhood had given him not just purpose, but joy, not just responsibility, but fulfillment. He had learned to balance firmness with compassion, to set boundaries while encouraging growth, to provide security while fostering independence. Most importantly, he had learned that healing from loss didn't require forgetting the past, but rather integrating it into a new and meaningful future. Mary's memory remained a cherished part of their family story, but it no longer defined the limits of Jackson's capacity for love. He had discovered that the heart could expand to accommodate new relationships without diminishing existing ones. that honoring the past could coexist with embracing the future. As he stood on his front porch, on the 1-year anniversary of the adoption, watching his children work in the gardens they'd planted together, Jackson reflected on the miracle of their shared journey. 9 abandoned children and 1 suicidal rancher had found each other at the exact moment when they all needed saving. And together, they had created something neither could have achieved alone. The Broken Arrow Ranch bore little resemblance to the failing operation he'd inherited from his father. It had become a symbol of innovation, resilience, and the power of unconventional families to thrive when given the opportunity. More than that, it had become a home in the truest sense, a place where love was expressed through daily care, where challenges were met with collective determination, where every member knew they belonged completely and permanently. In the quiet darkness of his home, filled with sleeping children, Jackson Hartwell finally understood what Mary had tried to tell him during those last difficult weeks. Life wasn't about avoiding loss or preventing pain. It was about choosing to love anyway, choosing to hope anyway, choosing to keep building something beautiful even when the world seemed determined to tear it down. 9 abandoned children had appeared out of nowhere at the exact moment a broken cowboy had planned to end his story. Instead, they had helped him begin an entirely new chapter, not just for himself, but for everyone whose lives they touched. And this new story, Jackson knew with absolute certainty, would continue to unfold in ways none of them could imagine. Written by 10 people who had chosen each other against all odds and refused to let go. The Broken Arrow Ranch stood as proof that miracles weren't supernatural events, but rather the natural result of love, determination, and the courage to keep trying when everything seemed hopeless. It was a testament to the truth that families could be created by choice, that healing was possible even after devastating loss, and that sometimes the best way to save yourself was to save someone else first. The ranch would continue to thrive. The children would grow into capable adults who carried its lessons forward, and the community would remember that when people refuse to give up on each other, extraordinary things become possible. This was their legacy, not just a successful ranch or a thriving family, but proof that love could triumph over abandonment, that hope could emerge from despair, and that the darkest moments could become the foundation for the brightest futures. The Broken Arrow Ranch had been reborn, and so had everyone who called it home. Years passed like seasons on the Montana plains, each bringing its own challenges and victories, its own moments of growth and celebration. The children who had once huddled together for survival now scattered across the country pursuing their dreams, but they always returned home for holidays and harvest time, bringing spouses and eventually grandchildren who filled the ranch with new laughter. Marcus graduated with honors from engineering school and started his own company designing sustainable farm equipment. His innovations helped small ranches across the region modernize their operations while maintaining their family character. He never forgot the lessons learned fixing broken tools with Jackson, and his designs reflected the practical wisdom of making things that lasted. Lily became a social worker specializing in alternative family placements, her own experience giving her unique insight into what children truly needed. She testified before state legislatures about reforming foster care systems, always carrying photographs of her siblings as evidence that unconventional families could thrive. Her advocacy work led to policy changes that prioritized keeping sibling groups together and recognizing kinship networks beyond biological relationships. Emma expanded her preserve business into a regional food company, employing dozens of people and sourcing ingredients from small farms throughout Montana. Her success story was featured in business magazines as an example of how rural entrepreneurship could revitalize agricultural communities. She established a scholarship fund for children aging out of foster care who wanted to start their own businesses. The ranch itself became a landmark, designated as a historical site not for its buildings or bloodlines, but for its role in pioneering new approaches to child welfare and sustainable agriculture. Tour groups visited regularly, learning about the integration of social services with agricultural education. Agricultural students completed internships there, studying methods that produced both healthy food and healthy families. Jackson, now in his 70s with silver threading through his hair, still rose before dawn to check on the animals. His daily routines had adapted to accommodate grandchildren who visited during school breaks, teaching them the same lessons about responsibility and care that had shaped their parents. The rope that had once represented his planned ending now served practical purposes around the ranch, securing loads, training horses, marking boundaries, transformed from a symbol of despair into a tool of daily life. The oak tree where he had contemplated suicide became a place of celebration instead. Each adoption anniversary, the family gathered beneath its branches for photographs and storytelling. Children and grandchildren carved their initials alongside Jackson and Mary's original marks, creating a living record of the family's growth across generations. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the house settled into peaceful rhythms, Jackson often sat on his porch reflecting on the unexpected turns his life had taken. The ranch that had once echoed with loneliness now hummed with constant activity, children calling from college, grandchildren visiting for summer adventures, former foster children stopping by to share their successes and seek advice. The Broken Arrow Ranch stood as permanent proof that second chances were real, that families could be chosen rather than merely inherited, and that the darkest moments often preceded the most extraordinary transformations. It demonstrated that saving someone else could be the surest way to save yourself, and that love multiplied rather than divided when shared without reservation. Jackson Hartwell had learned that miracles weren't supernatural interventions, but rather the natural result of refusing to surrender hope, even when hope seemed foolish. 9 children appearing at his moment of greatest despair had seemed impossible, but their arrival had revealed the truth that impossible things happened every day to people brave enough to embrace them. The ranch would continue long after Jackson was gone, operated by children who understood that land was more than property, it was legacy, responsibility, and opportunity combined. They would pass its lessons to their own children, ensuring that the Broken Arrow Ranch remained a place where broken people could find healing and abandoned dreams could take root again. This was the real miracle, not that 9 children had saved one man, but that together they had created something larger than any of them could have imagined, a family that proved love was stronger than loss, hope more powerful than despair, and that sometimes the best stories began at what seemed like the end. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.